Some news outlets have more integrity than others. Hello, and welcome to the channel. When animals went on trial in medieval times, imagine living in a world where animals could be arrested, put on trial, and even punished like humans. Sounds absurd, right? But in medieval Europe, this was a very real practice. From the 13th to the 18th century, courts across Europe held bizarre trials where pigs, rats, cows, goats, and even insects like locusts were charged with crimes. These animals were often accused of things like damaging crops, spreading disease, or even killing people. One of the strangest examples comes from 1386 in France, where a pig was put on trial for attacking and killing a child. The pig was dressed in human clothes, given a lawyer, and eventually sentenced to death by hanging. Just like a human criminal, animals weren't the only ones put on trial in medieval Europe. Sometimes inanimate objects, like a house, were charged with crimes, too. This may sound confusing, but it makes sense when you consider that the medieval legal system had some pretty unusual beliefs about responsibility. They believed that if something caused harm to a person or damaged a property, then someone or something had to be responsible. And if an object like a house caused damage, then it was the building's responsibility to make things right. So how exactly did these animal trials work? Well, first, an animal would have to be accused of a crime, usually by a member of the community who had been affected by the animal's actions. Then a warrant would be issued for the animal's arrest, and local officials would be responsible for bringing the animal before the court. It sounds like something out of a cartoon, but it was actually a very serious affair. The animals were often paraded through the streets in front of a crowd of onlookers, and the courtroom itself was no laughing matter. The accused animals were sometimes chained up and forced to stand trial without any legal representation. It was up to their owners or the people who brought them to court to act as their defense. But believe it or not, some animals did receive more due process than others. Sometimes wealthy or powerful people would take an interest in an animal's case and provide them with legal counsel. In some cases, these lawyers were willing to take on the most unlikely of clients. In 1478, an Italian lawyer named Bernardino de Montino wrote about a case he had worked on, where he defended a donkey accused of killing a child. The donkey, according to Bernardino, was so intelligent that it had planned its attack in advance. In another case, in the early 16th century, a rooster was accused of killing a woman by pecking her to death. This time, the bird was able to secure a lawyer and even had witnesses to support its innocence. According to the rooster's lawyer, the rooster was innocent because it couldn't possibly have killed the woman, since roosters can only peck, not strangle. What was life like for a lawyer during these trials? Well, it wasn't always easy. In fact, one French lawyer, Jean de Courage, complained about the stench of animals that filled the courtroom and the difficulty of getting them to behave. He also mentioned the tricky situation of defending an animal that could talk, and therefore could provide its side of the story. Despite the challenges, some lawyers took great pride in their work. They saw themselves as champions of justice, fighting for the rights of the accused animals and making sure they received a fair trial. It was a thankless task, but someone had to do it. But what if an animal was found guilty of a crime? What kind of punishments were they subjected to? As you might imagine, the punishments were often just as creative as the accusations. In the case of the pig that killed a child in 1386, the sentence was swift and severe. The pig was hanged, just like a human murderer. Other animals were given lesser punishments, such as being sewn up in a sack, along with a rock or two, as company. This punishment, known as ruing, was often used for animals that had damaged crops or livestock. It was a humiliating and terrifying experience for the animal, but it was also meant to serve as a warning to other potential troublemakers. Some animals were simply banned from certain areas. For example, in 1534, the English town of Newcastle passed an ordinance prohibiting pigs from the streets because they were getting out of control. In fact, they got so out of hand that the townspeople were considering banning them altogether. Can you imagine a world without bacon? Luckily, cooler heads prevailed and the ban was lifted. But why did people go to such extreme lengths? Medieval society believed that law and order applied to all of God's creatures. By putting animals on trial, they thought they were upholding divine justice and protecting the community from chaos. They believed that if they didn't hold animals accountable for their actions, then nothing would be sacred. And if that meant putting a pig on trial for murder, then so be it. It wasn't just about punishing the animals either. It was also about deterring them from committing crimes in the future. If an animal knew it could be put on trial and perhaps hanged for its actions, then it was less likely to misbehave. Or maybe it was just a way to distract people from their own problems. In a time when life was difficult and the future uncertain, putting on a good animal trial was a welcome distraction. It gave people something to talk about and a chance to forget their troubles for a while. After all, it's not every day that you see a pig in court. But why were animals accused of crimes in the first place? Was it just because people were bored and looking for entertainment? Actually, there were some practical reasons behind it. First of all, animals could cause serious problems in medieval society. They could destroy crops, spread disease, and even kill people. So it made sense to hold them accountable for their actions in some way. But it's also important to remember that medieval people saw the world differently than we do today. They believed that animals were not just creatures that lived alongside humans, but were actually part of the human community. In fact, some theologians argued that animals had souls and could go to heaven or hell after they died. So it's not surprising that they would be held to the same standards as humans in some ways. Finally, putting animals on trial was a way to maintain social order. In medieval Europe, the legal system was based on the idea that everyone was equal under the law, no matter how powerful or wealthy they were, and that included animals. By putting a pig on trial for murder, people were asserting their dominance over the natural world and reminding everyone that no one was above the law. What about those famous rat trials in France? What were they all about? Believe it or not, there were several instances in the 16th century where rats were put on trial for various crimes. The most common accusation was, as you guessed it, destroying crops. In one case, in 1533, a group of rats in the town of Compiègne were accused of eating grain and vegetables, causing hundreds of francs worth of damage. The rats were tried in absentia, meaning they didn't have to show up to court, which is probably a relief for them. Their lawyer argued that his clients did show up, because the journey to court was too dangerous because of the cats along the way. And shockingly, this defense was taken seriously. Cats, are natural enemies of rats, so it made sense that the rats wouldn't want to risk the trip. This trial, and others like it, may seem ridiculous to us today, but they were actually quite serious at the time. People believed that rats were responsible for spreading disease and ruining crops, and they had to be held accountable. In fact, the rat accused in this particular case was described as a public nuisance, which shows just how seriously they were taking the matter. Looking back, these trials seem more like a product of superstition and fear than a serious attempt at justice. But they do offer us a fascinating glimpse into the past. They show us how people once viewed the relationship between humans and animals, and how they tried to maintain order in a world that they did unfully understand. Next time you're watching a cartoon about talking animals or reading a fairy tale, remember that it's not that far-fetched. Animals were once put on trial in medieval Europe, just like in the stories. Maybe we should bring back the tradition. Who knows? We might learn a thing or two from our furry friends. Alright, comment below. Which era would you like to see covered next? Give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.